The only music in the High Sierra was the wind. It sang a thin, lonely song through the granite spires and ancient bristlecone pines, a melody unchanged for millennia. For John Mackay and his crew, it was the sound of failure. The canyon, which they had optimistically named Perseverance Gulch, was a dead end, in every sense of the word. The stream that trickled through its base was lazy and goldless. The quartz veins that seamed the cliffs were barren pyrite, fool's gold, that winked mockingly in the afternoon sun. It was September 12, 1872, and the dream of the 49ers was a ghost that haunted places like this, a whisper of wealth that had long since faded. John Mackay, a man whose 35 years looked more like 50, leaned on his long-handled shovel, his breath pluming in the crisp air. He was a monument of patience, his Irish heritage evident in the stubborn set of his jaw and the faded red of his hair, now streaked with granite dust. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, scanned the imposing walls of the box canyon. They were trapped, not by the rock, but by their own dwindling hope. "Another day, another handful of nothing," a voice grumbled. It was Eli, barely 19. His face still soft with youth, but hardening fast with disappointment. He kicked at the pile of loose scree, sending a cascade of stones clattering down the slope. "Patience, boy," Mackay said, his voice a low rumble. "The mountain doesn't give up its secrets easy. The mountain doesn't have any secrets. It's just stone." The other two members of their crew, the brothers Seamus and Finn O'Rourke, said nothing. They were busy setting a new charge of blasting powder, their movements practiced and weary. They were Mackay's cousins, bound by blood and shared desperation. They had left the played-out silver mines of Nevada for this, a lateral movement from one failure to another. Mackay's gaze, however, lingered on the scree where Eli had kicked. Something had caught the light. Not the flash of pyrite, but a steady, milky white gleam. He walked over, his boots crunching on the gravel, and bent down. He plucked the object from the dirt. It was a shard of porcelain, no larger than a silver dollar. It was unnaturally smooth and thin, translucent at its edges, and painted upon it in a delicate cobalt blue was the figure of a running deer, its form captured in a single, fluid brushstroke. It was beautiful. It was utterly, completely out of place. Eli wandered over. "What you got, John?" Mackay held it out on his calloused palm. "A deer." Eli peered at it. "China," he stated. "My ma had a cup like that. Fancy." He looked around the desolate canyon. "What in God's name is it doing here? Some rich fella's picnic got blown away?" Mackay didn't answer. He turned the fragment over. It spoke of a life of refinement, of quiet moments and settled homes. It was the absolute antithesis of their own grimy, rootless existence. The Central Pacific Railroad, which had employed thousands of Chinese laborers, was miles to the north. This was a place of no consequence, a geographical footnote. The China Shard was a sentence from a story that shouldn't have been written on this page. He slipped it into his pocket. It was a mystery, a tiny, insignificant puzzle piece. But John Mackay was a man who understood that the biggest veins of gold often started as the faintest of traces. That night, by the meager light of their campfire, the shard became a curiosity. Seamus, the more pragmatic of the brothers, shrugged. "Trash. People have been all through these hills, left their junk behind." "But why here?" Mackay pressed, staring into the flames. "This canyon leads nowhere. There's no gold, no reason for anyone to stay." "Maybe they were lost," Finn offered, his voice quiet. "Or maybe," Eli said, a spark of his old enthusiasm returning, "they were hiding." The notion hung in the smoky air, mingling with the scent of pine and beans. Hiding. It was a romantic idea, the stuff of penny dreadfuls, but the china shard, with its elegant, silent testimony, made it feel just possible enough to be tantalizing. The next day, McKay changed their orders. "Forget the quartz vein for today," he told them. "I want to know who else was here. Start digging around those foundation stones we saw near the north wall."
The work was slow and frustrating. They were miners, not archaeologists. But as the hours wore on, the mountain began to give up its ghosts. They found a rust-eaten tin, its paper label long since dissolved, but its shape unmistakably that of a tea caddy. Then Finn uncovered a broken stem of a pipe, its small bowl carved from a hard, dark wood. "Opium," Seamus identified it with a grimace. "Chinaman's pipe, for sure." Then Eli, digging with a renewed vigor, let out a cry. His shovel had struck not rock, but rotten wood. They carefully cleared the earth, revealing the remains of a crate. It fell apart at their touch, but inside, wrapped in a sheet of oilskin that had hardened like a beetle's carapace, was a book. It was a journal. The binding crumbled in McKay's hands, but the pages, though brittle and foxed with age, were mostly intact. He opened it carefully. The script was a waterfall of elegant vertical characters, utterly incomprehensible, but it was the illustrations that stole their breath. They were not sketches of landscapes or people. They were diagrams, intricate, technical drawings of gears, levers, and sluice gates, schematics for a massive water wheel. Complex mathematical calculations filled the margins. This was not the diary of a laborer, it was the workbook of an engineer. McKay turned the pages slowly, his rough hands feeling clumsy and profane against the delicate paper. And then, on the final page, he found it. A map. It was a detailed rendering of their canyon, but with additions that made his heart beat faster. It showed a network of tunnels leading deep into the mountain behind them, a honeycomb of passages all leading to a single central chamber, and marking that chamber was a small, hand-drawn symbol that needed no translation. A door, set squarely into a mountainside. A silence fell over the four men, broken only by the sigh of the wind. They all looked up as one, their eyes drawn to the sheer, unyielding granite wall at the back of the canyon. The wall was seamless, a solid, impenetrable face of stone. According to the map, the door was right there. Eli was the first to speak, his voice hushed with awe. "It's a treasure map." McKay shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving the rock. "No, Eli," he murmured. "I don't think it's treasure he buried." He looked down at the journal in his hands, then back at the wall. "I think he buried himself." The following days were consumed by a new kind of fever. The pursuit of gold was a greedy, frantic thing, but this was different. This was a hunt for truth, for a secret. They scoured the granite face, their hands brushing over every inch of cold, rough stone, searching for the lie in the mountain's facade. They tapped with hammers, listening for a hollow echo. They pried at cracks with crowbars. For 2 days, they found nothing. The granite was monolithic, indifferent to their efforts. Doubt began to creep in. Perhaps the map was a fantasy, the elaborate dream of a lonely engineer. Perhaps the door was metaphorical. On the 3rd day, as the afternoon sun threw long, distorted shadows across the canyon, it was McKay who found it. He was running his fingers along a nearly invisible vertical seam, a place where the rock looked slightly different, less weathered. He called the others over. "Here," he said, his voice tight with excitement. "Feel this." They did. The seam was straight, unnaturally straight. And as they cleared away a thick, stubborn patch of moss and lichen with their knives, they revealed it, a hair-thin line running from the ground up to a height of about 7 feet, where it met a similar horizontal line. It was a perfect, man-made rectangle, camouflaged with breathtaking skill. "It's a door," Eli breathed, his eyes wide. "A goddamn door in the mountain." The realization was staggering. The sheer effort, the precision, the patience required to create such a thing was beyond their comprehension. This was not the work of a few months. This was a lifetime's labor. Now came the problem of opening it. They tried pushing. They tried digging at its base. Nothing. Seamus, ever the powder man, suggested a small charge, but McKay vetoed it immediately. "We don't know what's behind it. We could bring the whole cliff down on our heads."
It was Finn, the quiet observer, who noticed it. "Look!" he said, pointing to a spot near the bottom of the right-hand seam. "The rock is smoother here, worn." McKay knelt. It was true. The granite had a slight polish, as if from repeated pressure. He placed his hands on the spot and pushed. Nothing. He leaned his shoulder into it, grunting with the strain. The rock didn't budge. "Maybe it pools," Eli suggested. But there was nothing to grip. Frustration mounted. They were staring at a locked vault with no key. As dusk began to settle, painting the canyon in shades of violet and gold, McKay had an idea. He retrieved a crowbar, and instead of trying to lever the door open, he jammed the tip into the worn spot at the bottom of the seam and pushed inward, using it as a pivot. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sound that was less a groan and more a deep, resonant sigh from the earth itself, the massive, 7-foot-tall block of granite moved. It pivoted inward on some unseen, perfectly balanced central axis, swinging a few inches with an almost graceful ease. A wave of air billowed out from the darkness within. It was cold, carrying the profound, musty chill of a long-sealed tomb and the faint, alien scent of old incense and dried herbs. It was the breath of another time. The 4 men stood frozen, staring into the impenetrable blackness. Eli fumbled for a lantern, his hands shaking so badly he could barely strike a match. The flame caught, casting a wobbly orange light that did little to push back the oppressive dark. McKay took the lantern. "Stay here," he ordered. "Like hell," Eli said, grabbing another lantern. Seamus and Finn exchanged a look, then nodded, arming themselves with a pick handle and a shovel. They were not being left behind. McKay took a deep breath, pushed the door open another foot with a grating screech of stone on stone, and stepped over the threshold. He was not in a cave. He was in a corridor. The walls were smoothly carved, the floor leveled. Timber beams, expertly fitted without a single nail, shored up the ceiling. The air was still and dead. The light from his lantern revealed a passageway that sloped gently downward, disappearing into the heart of the mountain. He took a few steps forward, his boots echoing in the profound silence. The others followed, a tight knot of humanity in the belly of the stone. "Hello?" Eli called out, his voice swallowed by the immensity of the space. There was no answer, only the echo.
They walked for what felt like an eternity, the corridor curving slowly to the left, and then the space opened up. McKay raised his lantern high, and the light finally found its limits, reflecting back from a cavernous space. The lantern light fell upon wooden structures. Bunks, stacked 3 high, lined one wall. Tables and benches stood in the center of the space,
still set with bowls and chopsticks as if waiting for their owners to return. Shelves were carved into the rock walls, holding an array of objects: tin cups, small wooden boxes, rolls of decaying cloth, a set of fine calligraphy brushes. It was a barracks, a home, but it was utterly, completely silent. A city of ghosts. Eli walked over to one of the tables and picked up a bowl. It was identical in make to the shard in Mackay's pocket. Fine, delicate bone china. He set it down with a clatter that seemed blasphemous in the silence. "Where'd they all go?" Finn whispered, his voice full of dread. Mackay didn't answer. He was looking deeper into the cavern, where his lantern light hinted at further passages, more chambers. This was just the antechamber. The heart of the place lay ahead. He moved forward, drawn by an irresistible pull. The others followed, their fear now mixed with a burgeoning, overwhelming curiosity. They passed through the barracks and into a narrower tunnel. The sound of dripping water grew louder. The tunnel opened into a second, even larger chamber. And here they stopped, their mouths agape. A narrow waterfall, diverted from some underground aquifer, cascaded down one wall into a carved channel. This channel fed a large, perfectly preserved wooden water wheel, which was connected by a series of leather belts and clever wooden gears to a massive stone wheel. It was a grist mill. To the side, more channels directed water through a series of sluices and holding tanks, a sophisticated water management system. They built a factory, Samus said, his pragmatic mind struggling to compute the scene. Down here in the dark. "It's not a factory," Mackay said, his voice full of awe. "It's a civilization." But the true marvel was yet to come. On the far side of the hydraulic chamber was another, smaller opening. Mackay led them toward it. This chamber was different. It was quieter, drier. The walls were lined with shelves, but these were not holding tools or bowls. They were filled with books, dozens of them. Hundreds, leather-bound journals, scrolls tied with silk cords, folded maps. In the center of the room was a large table, carved from a single slab of rock, upon which lay an open journal, a set of inkstones, and brushes, all waiting for a hand that would never return.
Mackay walked to the table, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked down at the open journal. The script was the same as in the book they had found outside, but next to the text was a drawing that made the breath catch in his throat. It was a detailed, incredibly accurate sketch of the Orion Nebula, its swirling gases rendered with an artist's touch and an astronomer's precision. These men were not just engineers and laborers, they were scholars, scientists. He had stumbled upon a library of forgotten knowledge, a university hidden from the world. Eli, who had been peering at the shelves, let out a low whistle. "John," he said, "look at this." He pointed to a stack of ledgers. Mackay pulled one down and opened it. It was written in English. It was a payroll ledger from the Central Pacific Railroad, but next to the listed names, Ah Song, Li Wei, Chen Yong, were not dollar amounts, but a single stark word: deceased. Page after page of it, hundreds of names, and next to each, a date and a brief, chilling note. Avalanche, Donner Summit, blasting accident, Tunnel 9, dysentery, Camp 4. This was a record of the dead, a memorial. Mackay looked up from the grim ledger, his eyes meeting those of his crew. They stood in the silent, lamp-lit library, surrounded by the legacy of the men who had built the West. The air was thick with the weight of the discovery. They had found no chests of gold, no nuggets the size of a man's fist, They had found something infinitely more valuable and infinitely more dangerous. The truth. And in that moment, they all understood the terrible choice that now lay before them. They could bring this truth to the world, or they could seal it back into the mountain, letting the ghosts keep their secrets. Outside, the wind continued its ancient song, unaware that the silence of the canyon had been broken, and that the world, for 4 weary miners, had just become immeasurably larger and more complicated.
The silence in the library was a physical presence, thick and heavy with the dust of years and the weight of countless untold stories. The 4 men stood frozen, the flickering lantern light casting dancing, monstrous shadows that seemed like the ghosts of the readers who had once inhabited this space. Eli was the first to break the spell. He reached out a trembling hand towards the open journal on the stone table, the one with the nebula sketch. "Don't!" McKay's voice was low, but it cracked through the silence like a whip. Eli's hand jerked back as if burned. "We touch nothing more, not until we understand what this is." "Understand?" Samos's voice was strained, his face pale in the lamplight. "John, it's a tomb, a bloody library and a tomb. We need to get out of here." The superstitious dread of the Irish miner was rising in him, a fear of disturbing slumbering spirits. "This isn't a tomb," McKay said, his gaze sweeping the room. "There are no bodies. It's a sanctuary. They left, but they planned to come back." He pointed to the brushes and inkstone, laid out with precise care. "You don't leave your tools like that if you're fleeing. You leave them like that if you're coming back after supper." "Then where are they?" Ellie asked, his voice barely a whisper. McKay had no answer. He turned his attention back to the ledger in his hands, the grim roll call of the dead. He flipped a page, then another. The dates clustered around the brutal winter of 1866-67, the push over the Sierra summit. The sheer number of names was staggering. It was an industrial-scale slaughter, neatly recorded in columns of ink. "Look at this," he said, more to himself than the others. He pointed to a name, Li Wei. Next to it was scrawled, "Deceased, Avalanche, Summit Tunnel." But then, a few pages later, the same name appeared again, Li Wei. But this time, the deceased was crossed out with a single sharp line, and next to it was written a single character in Chinese, and below that, in a different, more precise hand, the English word, relocated. A cold finger traced a path down McKay's spine. Relocated? Relocated where? Here? He slammed the ledger shut, the sound like a gunshot in the quiet chamber. "We need a system. We look, but we don't touch. We map this place. We need to know how big it is, what's here, and we look for him. Li Wei." The name hung in the air. Li Wei. The engineer, the astronomer, the ghost in their machine. For the next week, they became cartographers of the underworld. They ventured into the mountain each day, their world shrinking to the circle of lantern light. They discovered that the hidden city was far more extensive than they had first imagined. Beyond the barracks and the hydraulic chamber, they found a tailor's shop with bolts of faded silk and cotton and a clever foot-pedaled sewing machine. They found an infirmary stocked with ceramic jars labeled with intricate characters, still holding dried herbs that filled the air with a pungent medicinal scent. They found a kitchen with massive cast-iron woks and a sophisticated ventilation system that channeled smoke through a near-invisible fissure in the mountain high above. They found a workshop filled with precision tools for woodworking and metalworking, where spare parts for the water wheel had been meticulously crafted.
Everywhere, the story was the same: order, precision, and a sudden, planned departure. It was as if the entire population had simply stood up one day and walked out, confident of their return. It was Eli, exploring a narrow offshoot from the library, who found the heart of the mystery. He called from McKay, his voice echoing with excitement. "John, in here! I think this is his room." The chamber was smaller than the library, more personal. A simple bed frame with a reed mat stood in one corner. A small desk was carved from the rock, and on the walls, Li Wei had carved his story. It was a timeline, etched into the granite with a master's hand. On the left, scenes of the railroad, tiny figures swinging hammers, carts on tracks, explosions ripping through rock. The figures were stylized, but the suffering was palpable. Then a break, a vertical line. To the right of the line, the world changed. The carvings showed the construction of the hidden city, the carving of the door, the building of the water wheel, the digging of the barracks. It was a visual history of their exodus and their creation. And at the very end, a final, complex panel. It showed a group of figures, larger than the others, walking single file out of the mountain door. They were not carrying picks or shovels. They carried books and tools and seedlings in pots. They were heading east, away from California, into the blank, uncarved stone of the future. "They left," McKay murmured, tracing the figures with his finger. "They finished what they built here, and then they moved on, to somewhere else." "But why?" Eli asked, bewildered. "They built all this. Why abandon it?" McKay's eyes fell on the desk. A single leather-bound journal lay there, separate from the others. It was not filled with technical drawings or star charts. It was a diary, and on its first page, in a shaky but legible English, was written, "If you find this, you are either a friend or a thief. I pray for the former. My name is Li Wei. This is the story of why we came here, what we built, and why we had to leave. The world was not ready for us. Perhaps in your time it will be." McKay picked up the journal. This was the voice. This was the key. That night, back in their surface camp, as a cold wind whipped down from the peaks, McKay sat by the fire and began to read aloud. The others gathered around, their faces illuminated by the flames, listening as the ghost of Li Wei began to speak.
"I was born in the year of the rabbit, in a village near Canton, where the air was thick with the scent of lychee and the sound of my father's students reciting the classics. He was a scholar, a man who believed the universe could be understood through ink and paper. He taught me the stars, not as lights in the sky, but as a clockwork of sublime mathematics. I dreamed of being an astronomer, of adding my own small verse to the great song of the heavens." McKay's voice was a low rumble, giving weight to Li Wei's elegant prose. "But fate is a river with a current of its own. The Taiping Rebellion came. War, famine, death. The world of ink and starlight was burned away. To save our family from ruin, I signed a contract. I became a laborer for the Central Pacific Railroad. I traded my telescope for a sledgehammer. The journey across the ocean was a death in itself. We were packed in the hold like salted fish, the stench of vomit and despair our constant companion. When we saw the Golden Mountain, as they called California, it was not gold that greeted us, but mud and cold and the towering, impossible wall of the Sierra Nevada. The work was a kind of hell I could never have conceived. The white foreman called us coolies, a word that stripped us of our names, our histories, our humanity. We were given the most dangerous tasks. We were the ones sent to hang in wicker baskets over 1,000-foot drops to set the blasting charges. We were the ones who tunneled through the snow, digging out entire locomotives buried in avalanches. The pay was a fraction of what the Irishmen received. The food was often rotten. We died by the score." McKay paused. looking up at the faces of Seamus and Finn, fellow laborers. They looked uncomfortable, shifting their weight. They had heard stories, of course, but this was a voice from the other side, a testament they could not ignore. It was during the great winter of '66, trapped in the snows at the summit, that the idea was born. We were not just dying from the cold and the avalanches. We were dying from a sickness of the soul. We were being erased. I gathered a few men I trusted, a doctor from Beijing, a master carpenter from Shanghai, a farmer from my own province. We spoke in whispers, huddled in our snowbound bunkhouse. We decided we would not be erased. We would vanish. The plan was audacious. We would fake our deaths. It was not difficult. The railroad was careless with our lives and indifferent to our names. A report of an avalanche, a name crossed off a list, a body unrecoverable. It was the bureaucracy of oblivion, and we used it to our advantage. One by one, over the course of a year, we disappeared from the rolls of the Central Pacific Railroad. Li Wei, the astronomer, died in an avalanche, but Li Wei, the man, walked away.
We chose this canyon for its isolation and its secret. The water source was key, and so we began to build not just a hiding place, but a new world. We built the door, our first and greatest achievement, a testament to our will to be separate. We built the water wheel to give us power and life. The library was my own vanity, my attempt to preserve a world I feared was lost forever. For 5 years, we thrived. We were a community of thinkers and craftsmen, freed from the whip and the curse. We grew our own food in hidden terraces on the southern slope. We were happy. The journal then detailed the daily life of the city, the debates in the library, the concerts played on handmade instruments, the marriages, the births of children who knew only the inside of the mountain. It was a utopia, carved from granite. Then the tone of the journal changed. But the world outside has long arms. A trapper, a half-madman named Henderson, stumbled upon our canyon. He saw the terraces. He saw the smoke from our concealed chimney. He did not see the door, but he knew men were here. He came to us not with hostility, but with a warning. He told us that the railroad barons, the men who had built their fortunes on our bones, were consolidating their power. They were buying up land, entire counties. Surveyors were coming, mapping every valley, every stream. Our canyon would not remain hidden for long. We held a council. We could fight, but we were scholars and farmers, not soldiers. We could hide deeper, but that was a return to the tomb we had escaped. Dr. Zhang, our physician, proposed a third path. He had heard stories from the trapper of vast empty lands to the east, beyond the Great Basin, places where the maps were blank. He spoke of a place called the Colorado Plateau, a labyrinth of canyons where 1,000 cities could be lost. It was a terrifying prospect. To leave the home we had built with our own hands, to journey into the unknown. But to stay was to be discovered, to be dragged back into the world that had enslaved us, our sanctuary defiled, our story twisted into a lie. We put it to a vote. The decision was unanimous. We would leave. And so, we prepare for our second exodus. We will take our knowledge, our seeds, our most precious books. We will seal the door behind us, leaving this place as a monument to what we were. We go to find a new silence, a new blank space on the map. Perhaps we will succeed. Perhaps we will fail. This journal I leave behind, a message in a bottle thrown into the sea of time. We were here. We lived.
We were more than the railroad. Remember us. Leeway.
The fire had burned down to embers. No one spoke for a long time. The wind seemed to have stilled, as if in respect. The story was complete. They had their answers. Eli wiped a tear from his eye, unashamed. They just walked away, into the desert. They were brave men, Finn said, his voice thick with emotion. Braver than any of us. Seamus, however, was practical. Aye, it's a grand story, a tragedy, but it doesn't put food in our bellies or gold in our pockets, John. What do we do now? We can't very well follow them? McKay closed the journal, its weight immense in his hands. He looked from the earnest face of Eli to the worried faces of the O'Rourkes, and then towards the dark, silent entrance to the mountain. We protect it, McKay said, his voice firm, final. This isn't our story to sell. It's theirs. We seal the door, we hide the entrance better than they did. We take their secret, and we keep it. It was in that moment of decision that a new sound reached them, one that did not belong to the mountain or the wind, the distant, unmistakable report of a rifle shot echoing from the far end of the canyon. Then a voice, loud and coarse, shouted from the darkness beyond their camp. Well, 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 what have we here? Looks like you boys have been busy. Standing at the edge of the firelight was Silas Rourke, the most ruthless claim jumper in the High Sierra, and 4 of his men. They were armed with rifles and wore the predatory grins of men who had finally cornered their prey. Rourke's eyes scanned their camp and then lingered on the freshly disturbed earth around the massive, now visible stone door. And what, pray tell, Rourke said, his smile widening into a greedy slash, is behind door number 1?
Time seemed to freeze. The crackle of the embers was deafening. McKay slowly stood up, placing Leeway's journal carefully behind him on his bedroll. The O'Rourke brothers moved instinctively, putting themselves between Rourke and the door. Eli stood his ground, his hand drifting towards the pickaxe leaning against the rock. Silas Rourke was a big man, gone to fat, but with a core of hardened muscle. A jagged scar ran from his temple to his chin, a souvenir from a Bowie knife fight. He was known for his motto, "Finders keepers, and I'm always the finder." "Evening, McKay," Rourke said, his voice a friendly drawl that didn't reach his cold, pig-like eyes. "Heard a rumor you boys had a bit of luck. Thought I'd come pay my respects." "We've got nothing for you, Rourke," McKay said, his voice level. "This claim is played out. You're wasting your time." Rourke chuckled, a sound like gravel shaking in a tin. "It don't look played out from where I'm standing. That's a mighty interesting piece of masonry for a played-out claim." He took a step forward, his men fanning out behind him. "Why don't you be neighborly and show us what you found? We'll split it, fair and square, 60-40. "This isn't a gold mine, Silas," McKay said, his mind racing. He had to get them away from the door. He had to protect the city. "Then what is it?" one of Rourke's men, a lanky, cruel-looking man named Dobbs, sneered. "Your secret hidey hole?" "Something like that," McKay said. He made a decision, a desperate gamble. It's a tomb, an Indian burial cave. We sealed it back up out of respect. There's nothing in there but bones and bad luck." Rourke's smile vanished. "You take me for a fool, McKay? I've been watching you for a week. You've been going in and out of that hole like ants. You ain't respecting no bones. You found something in there. Something big." He raised his rifle, not aiming at anyone, but making his intention clear. "Now you're going to open that door, or we're going to open it with blasting powder and see what shakes loose." A standoff. McKay calculated the odds. They were 4 against 5, and Rourke's men were hired guns. A fight here would be bloody, and they would likely lose. And if they lost, the city would be desecrated. "All right," McKay said, holding up his hands in a gesture of surrender. "All right, Rourke, you win. But it's not what you think. It's a story. A history. I don't read books, McKay. I spend money. Now open it." McKay nodded slowly to Seamus, whose face was a mask of fury and betrayal. Reluctantly, Seamus and Finn moved to the door. They placed their crowbars and pushed. With its now familiar groan, the great stone door pivoted inward, revealing the dark maw of the corridor. The cold, ancient air washed over them. Rourke's men recoiled slightly, but Rourke's eyes gleamed with avarice. "Lanterns," he ordered. Dobbs lit a couple and handed one to Rourke. "You first, McKay," he said, gesturing with his rifle. "Show us the way." Trapped, McKay led them inside. He walked slowly, his mind frantically searching for a way out, a way to minimize the damage. He led them straight through the barracks, not giving them time to linger.
Rourke's men, however, were already looting. One of them swept a table clear of the china bowls, the delicate porcelain shattering on the stone floor. The sound was like a scream. "Will you look at this?" Dobbs laughed, picking up a carved opium pipe. "A Chinaman's den." "Leave it," Mackay growled, but a rifle barrel jabbed into his back, urging him forward. He led them into the hydraulic chamber. The sight of the massive, silent water wheel stopped even Rourke in his tracks. "What in the name of?" Rourke murmured, his voice full of awe for the first time. "Who built this?" "The men who built the railroad. The Chinese. This was their home." Rourke's awe quickly turned back to greed. "So where's the gold? They must have paid 'em something, their wages, their savings. It's got to be here somewhere." "There is no gold," Mackay said, his voice tight. "This is what they built instead." "Bullshit," Rourke snarled. "Everyone has gold. Search it. Tear this place apart if you have to." Mackay's heart sank as Rourke's men began to ransack the chamber, overturning tables, smashing storage chests. They were vandals, blind to the beauty and the history, seeing only potential containers for treasure. It was then that Eli, who had been walking behind them, silent and seething, saw his chance. As they moved from the hydraulic chamber towards the library, he lagged behind. He remembered a small, narrow maintenance tunnel that ran behind the water wheel, one they had discovered days earlier. It was a tight squeeze, but it led back towards the entrance. While Rourke and his men were distracted by the prospect of the library, Eli slipped away into the darkness. In the library, Rourke was growing increasingly furious. He swept an arm across a shelf, sending a cascade of precious journals and scrolls tumbling to the floor. "Words! Nothing but goddamn words! I want gold!" "Rourke, you're destroying something priceless," Mackay shouted, lunging forward. Dobbs clubbed him across the back with his rifle stock, sending Mackay to his knees, gasping for air. "It's worthless." Rourke kicked a pile of books. "A bunch of dead Chinamen scribbling." It was at that moment that a strange sound began to echo through the chambers. It started as a low rumble, then grew into a deep, grinding roar. The very mountain seemed to be shuddering. Rourke and his men froze, their faces suddenly pale with fear. "What is that? An earthquake?" Eli stood on his knees and looked up. He knew that sound. It was the sound of the great stone door grinding shut.
Eli.
The lanterns flickered, the roar intensified, and then, with a final, definitive thud that vibrated through the stone beneath their feet, it stopped. The silence that followed was absolute and terrifying. We're trapped, McKay thought, but so are they. Panic erupted among Rourke's men. The door's shut! Who did that? Rourke screamed, his voice cracking with fear. He swung his rifle wildly, pointing it at McKay and the O'Rourkes. You planned this. We were all trapped in here, you idiot, Seamus yelled back. In the confusion, McKay got to his feet. The dynamic had shifted. Rourke was no longer a hunter in control. He was a rat in a cage, and a cornered rat is dangerous. But he was also afraid. You know a way out, Rourke said, leveling his rifle at McKay's chest. There's always another way out of a place like this. You tell me, or I swear to God I'll put a billet in you and let your bones rot here with these chinks. McKay met his gaze. He thought of Li Wei and his people, walking fearlessly into the unknown. He thought of Eli, who had just sacrificed them all to save the city. He felt a strange calm settle over him. Li Wei left a journal, McKay said, his voice eerily calm. He said the world wasn't ready for them. I think he was right. He looked at the terrified, greedy faces of Rourke's men. Let me tell you the rest of the story. It's about how we all got left behind.
The profound silence that followed the door's closing was more terrifying than any sound. The air, once cool and still, now felt thin and suffocating. The 5 lanterns in the library seemed to burn less brightly, their light swallowed by the oppressive darkness that pressed in from the entrance corridor. Rourke's bravado evaporated, replaced with a primal, sweat-sheened fear. He swung his rifle from McKay to the O'Rourkes, his eyes wide and wild. "Open it!" he screamed, the sound shrill in the cavern. "There's a mechanism. There has to be." "The mechanism is on the outside," McKay said, his voice flat. He remained on his knees, the pain in his back a dull, throbbing reminder of Dobbs's rifle stock. "It's a counterweight system. It can only be opened from out there." "You're lying," Rourke shrieked, stepping forward and pressing the barrel of his rifle against McKay's forehead. The cold metal was a promise of oblivion. "Your boy did this. He's out there. He'll open it." "Eli is following my orders," McKay lied, maintaining eye contact. He needed to seize control of the narrative, of their fear. "If a single one of you harms us, you'll rot in here, all of you." Dobbs and the other 3 men shifted uneasily. Their greed had been supplanted by a more basic instinct: survival. The mountain was no longer a potential treasure chest, it was a sepulcher. "Boss," one of them, a younger man named Clem, whispered, his voice trembling. "Maybe we should listen to him." Rourke's jaw worked, his mind racing. He was a bully, not a strategist. His power came from immediate, overwhelming force, and that power was now neutralized. He lowered the rifle, but his eyes remained murderous. "Fine. Talk. What's your play, McKay?" "My play," McKay said, slowly getting to his feet, "is that we find another way out." Rourke barked a harsh, disbelieving laugh. "Another way? You just said there wasn't one." "I said the door could only be opened from the outside," McKay corrected him, his mind latching on to a fragment of Li Wei's journal. Li Wei and his people didn't vanish into thin air. They left. They walked out of this mountain and headed east. They didn't use this door. The implication hung in the stale air. Another exit. "Where?" Rourke demanded, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "I don't know," McKay admitted, "but the answer is in here." He gestured to the library, to the scattered journals on the floor. we find Li Wei's final journal entries, he would have recorded the route. It's our only chance. A new, desperate purpose united them. Rourke's men, now more frightened of the mountain than of their boss, began frantically gathering the fallen books, handing them to Mackay and the O'Rourkes. For hours they worked. Their world shrunk to the circle of lantern light, the musty smell of old paper, and the terrifying, ever-present knowledge that their air was finite. Seamus found it. It was tucked inside a ledger of botanical sketches, a final slim sheaf of pages sewn together with silk thread. "John," Seamus said, his voice hoarse, "it's a map of the mountain."
They gathered around. It was a cross-section, drawn with an engineer's precision. It showed the chambers they knew, the barracks, the hydraulic room, the library. But from the back of the library, a narrow, almost invisible passage was indicated, snaking down, deep into the bedrock. It led to a subterranean river labeled in Chinese characters. Next to it, Li Wei had written a single English phrase, "The River of Heaven, our path to the world." "It's a water exit," Finn breathed. "They went out by the river." "Where does it come out?" Rourke snapped, grabbing the map. Mackay studied it. The river tunnel ran for what looked like miles, emerging on the eastern slope of the Sierra in a box canyon that would be invisible from any known trail. "There," he pointed. "It empties into a lake, a place called Whisper Lake. It's not on any map I've ever seen." "Then that's where we're going," Rourke said, his confidence returning. "Let's move." "Wait," Mackay said, his voice firm. "We do this my way. We move carefully, we take only what we need, and we leave this place as we found it." Rourke scowled but nodded. The balance of power had shifted. Mackay held the knowledge, and knowledge in the belly of the mountain was more powerful than any rifle. They gathered their remaining lanterns, filled their canteens from the clean, cold water of the hydraulic channel, and prepared for the descent. Mackay, with a final, lingering look at Li Wei's desk, carefully placed the final journal inside his shirt, against his chest. It was their passport to freedom. The passage behind the library was a crack in the world, so narrow they had to turn sideways to slip through. The air grew colder, damper. The sound of dripping water was constant, a liquid clock counting down the seconds of their journey. The lantern light revealed walls slick with mineral deposits, and the floor was a treacherous slope of loose, wet stone. They walked for what felt like an eternity, the tunnel sloping ever downward. The air began to change, carrying a new sound, a low, distant roar that grew with every step, the sound of moving water. Finally, the tunnel opened into a colossal cavern, so vast their lantern light could not reach the ceiling. Before them, churning in the darkness, was the River of Heaven. It was not a gentle stream, but a powerful, fast-moving torrent, perhaps 50 feet across, its black water flecked with white foam. It emerged from a tunnel in one rock wall and disappeared into another on the far side. Lasered to a rusted iron ring set into the stone was the skeleton of a raft. It was large, capable of holding a dozen men, constructed of stout timber that had somehow resisted rot in the dry, cold air. Tied next to it were 2 long poles. "They left it," Eli said, his voice full of wonder. "It's a death trap," Dobbs muttered, staring at the churning water. "It's our only way," Mackay said. He tested the ropes. They were stiff but strong. "Help me get it into the water." Working together, the 9 men managed to shove the heavy raft into the river. It bucked and spun in the current, a wild thing. They clambered on board, Seamus and Finn using the poles to push them away from the shore and into the main flow. The moment the current took them, they were plunged into a nightmare. The roar of the water was deafening. The raft spun and lurched, slamming against unseen rocks. They were hurtled into the downstream tunnel, swallowed by darkness, their world reduced to the violent, unpredictable motion of the raft and the tiny, swaying island of light from their lanterns, which they had lashed to the mast. McKay clung to the ropes, his knuckles white. He saw the terror on every face, on Eli's youthful features, on the grim masks of the O'Rourkes, even on the hardened faces of Rourke's men. In the face of the mountain's raw power, all their conflicts seemed petty and small. The journey was a timeless, terrifying interval. They shot through roaring rapids, drifted through eerily silent stretches where the ceiling hung so low they had to lie flat, and navigated whirlpools that threatened to suck them under. They lost one of their lanterns to a sudden jolt, the glass shattering and the flame dying with a hiss, plunging half the raft into near darkness. Just as it felt the river would never end, a pinprick of light appeared ahead. It was not the warm yellow of sunlight, but the cool gray light of dawn. "The end!" Eli shouted over the roar. The river accelerated, spewing them out of the mountain and into the blinding open air. They shot out from a cliff face, cascading 20 feet down into the deep, placid waters of a small, perfectly circular lake, surrounded on all sides by sheer rock walls. Whisper Lake. The raft, released from the torrent's grip, settled and drifted gently towards a gravelly shore. The men collapsed, gasping, laughing with hysterical relief, kissing the solid ground. They had escaped. But the mountain was not yet done with them. As they lay panting on the shore, Rourke's gaze fell upon the bulge in McKay's shirt. The journal. In the light of day, freed from the immediate threat of death, the old dynamics reasserted themselves. Greed returned.
"I'll be taking that," Rourke said, getting to his feet and leveling his rifle once more. The other 4 members of his crew, their confidence restored, did the same. McKay stood slowly, his body aching. "It's over, Rourke. You're alive. Be content with that." "The hell it is," Rourke sneered. "That book is a map back to a city full of something. Maybe there's no gold, but there's something in there, something I can sell. The location alone is worth a fortune." "There's nothing for you there," McKay said, his voice cold. "It's a grave. You just be a grave robber." "Then I'll be a rich grave robber," Rourke said, and he gestured for Dobbs to take the journal. It was then that Seamus O'Rourke moved. He didn't go for a weapon. He simply took 2 quick steps and shoved Rourke hard from behind. Rourke caught off balance, stumbled forward. His rifle discharged, the shot echoing like a thunderclap across the silent lake. The bullet whined past McKay's ear. In that split second of chaos, McKay lunged. He didn't go for the gun. He went for Rourke's arm, twisting it, forcing the rifle down. The 2 men fell to the gravel, grappling. The rest erupted into a brawl. Eli and Finn tackled 2 of Rourke's men. Seamus squared off against Dobbs. The 3rd man, Clem, hesitated, his rifle wavering. On the ground, McKay and Rourke fought with the brutal efficiency of men fighting for their lives. Rourke was bigger, stronger, fueled by rage. He got his hands around McKay's throat, squeezing, his thumbs pressing into McKay's windpipe. Spots danced before his eyes. He clawed at Rourke's face, but the man was a beast. Through the roaring in his ears, he heard a voice. It was Eli's. "John!" He saw Eli break free from his own struggle, and in a single fluid motion pick up one of the long poling oars from the raft. He swung it like a baseball bat. The crack of wood on skull was sickening. Rourke's grip went slack. His eyes rolled back in his head, and he slumped sideways onto the gravel, unconscious. The fight went out of his men instantly. Dobbs, seeing his boss down, dropped his rifle and held up his hands. The others followed suit. McKay got to his feet, gasping for air, his throat on fire. He looked at Rourke's still form, then at Eli, who stood panting, the oar still in his hands, his face a mixture of terror and grim satisfaction. "It's done, John," Eli said. McKay nodded. He walked over to the lake's edge, picked up a large, smooth stone, and returned to Rourke's side. He knelt, and with a few sharp, precise blows, he smashed the firing mechanism of Rourke's prized rifle, rendering it useless.
He did the same to the other 4 rifles. "Take your boss and get out of these mountains," McKay told Dobbs, his voice a ragged whisper. "If I ever see any of you again, I won't be as merciful." Silently, sullenly, the 4 men hoisted the unconscious Rourke and began the long, difficult climb out of the box canyon, weaponless and defeated. The 4 companions were alone again. The sun was now fully above the rim of the canyon, bathing the lake in a golden light. They had faced the mountain, greed, and death itself, and they had survived. McKay looked at the journal in his hand, then back at the dark, silent opening in the cliff face from which the river of heaven emerged. It was the last connection to Li Wei's world. He walked to the water's edge. He thought of the delicate china shard, the silent barracks, the humming water wheel, the library of wonders. He thought of Li Wei's courage, his determination to preserve beauty and knowledge in a world of brutality. The world was not ready for Li Wei's story. It would be turned into a carnival attraction, a target for looters, a subject for cynical debate. The sanctuary would be destroyed, its magic lost forever. He made his decision. He drew back his arm and threw the journal. It spun through the air, a flutter of white pages, and landed in the center of the deep, placid lake. It floated for a moment, like a dying swan, and then the water soaked into the pages, and it sank, disappearing into the dark, pure depths of Whisper Lake. Eli let out a small, strangled cry of protest, but Seamus put a hand on his shoulder. "He's right, lad. Some secrets are too heavy to carry into the light." McKay turned to them. "We were never here. We found a small pocket of gold dust in Perseverance Gulch, just enough to get by. We never saw a door. We never heard the name Li Wei. This," he gestured to the lake, the canyon, the mountain, "this dies with us." One by one, they nodded. They had become the guardians of the mountain, the keepers of the silence. It was a burden they would carry for the rest of their lives. But it was also a privilege.
Epilogue. 20 years later, San Francisco. The mansion on Nob Hill was a testament to success. Built with the profits from the profitable Comstock Lode silver claims that John McKay had shrewdly invested in after his mining days, it was one of the finest in the city. Inside, in a wood-paneled study, McKay sat by the fire. His hair was fully white now, his face lined with the years, but his eyes still held the calm, steady light of the man who had faced down a mountain. A young university professor sat across from him, a man named David Chen, who was the head of the newly established Department of Eastern Archaeology and Astronomy at Stanford University. The department had been anonymously endowed by a generous benefactor 5 years prior. "And the grant has allowed us to acquire the Whipple collection of Ming Dynasty star charts," Professor Chen was saying, his eyes bright with passion. "It's a remarkable resource. It's as if our benefactor understands precisely the gaps in our knowledge that need filling, the intersection of practical engineering and cosmological study in pre-modern China." McKay smiled faintly. "I'm sure he does." He picked up a small, flat box from the table beside him. "I have something for you, Professor, a token of support." He handed the box to Chen. The professor opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a single exquisite object, a fragment of bone china painted with a delicate cobalt blue deer frozen in mid-leap. Chen caught his breath. This is magnificent. The workmanship. It's from the Qing dynasty, I'd wager, but it's just a fragment." "A reminder," McKay said, his gaze distant. that the most complete stories are often the ones that are broken, that we have to piece together ourselves with patience and respect. That the truth isn't always a full vessel, sometimes it's just a shard pointing the way. Professor Chen looked from the shard to the old man's face, sensing a depth of meaning he couldn't quite grasp. "Thank you, Mr. Mackay. It's a powerful metaphor. I shall treasure it." After the professor had left, Mackay walked to the window, looking out over the bustling modern city. He could still feel the cold, still air of the library, see the lamplight falling on Li Wei's desk. He could still hear the groan of the great stone door and the roaring of the river of heaven.
He had not brought Li Wei's story into the world, but he had, in his own way, prepared the world for it. He had funded a department, supported scholars like Chen, and helped create a world where the achievements of men like Li Wei might one day be met not with greed or skepticism, but with the understanding and reverence they deserved. He had not broken his vow of silence. He had simply learned to speak in a different language, the language of patronage, of education, of quiet influence. The granite codex was safe, hidden in the mountain's heart, and its key was no longer a map or a journal, but a seed of knowledge he had planted in the future. He reached into his waistcoat pocket and took out his own personal reminder. Not the China shard, which was now on its own journey, but something else he had taken from the library that final day. A single, fine calligraphy brush, its bamboo stem smooth and dark with age. He held it, feeling the weight of the stories it had written, the dreams it had recorded. Outside, the fog was rolling in from the bay, swallowing the city, just as the mountain had swallowed the truth. But some truths, he knew, were like stars. Even when you couldn't see them, they were still there, burning in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to be seen again. The end.